Trump declares, "War is over after Gaza deal." When Donald Trump took the pulpit and said in a slow, assured voice, "The war is over," the world stopped. Some breathed a sigh of relief, others frowned. After all, since when does a war end with words alone? This is the contradiction that makes history go around. Great leaders always promise peace, but almost never explain what they're willing to sacrifice for it. And when Trump speaks, it's not just a man giving a speech, it's the empire of narratives in action. Because on the global political stage, every sentence is a bomb with a different fuse. The announcement sounded like a prophecy disguised as victory. The public cheered, the networks lit up, and the markets reacted as if the future had been rewritten in real time. But behind the glare of the cameras, there was something disconcerting. The proclaimed peace seemed too good to be true. The Middle East is not a simple chessboard. It is a maze of broken promises and conflicting interests. And when someone tries to declare the end of a war, there are always those who see only the beginning of another, quieter, more strategic, more dangerous. It's curious how the world has become accustomed to applauding headlines before understanding the plot. Trump knew this, and used global disbelief as fuel. He didn't just announce the end of a war. He turned the announcement into a spectacle. But the question that hangs in the air, and that no one dares answer, is simple and frightening. Is the peace he sold real, or just the interlude between two chapters of the same conflict? The surprising announcement: the war is over. The world stopped for a few seconds. Donald Trump appeared before the cameras, with that firm gaze and the tone of someone who knows that every word weighs a ton on the scales of geopolitics. "The war is over," he said, and the phrase echoed like thunder disguised as relief. In Gaza, some celebrated. Others simply looked to the sky, suspicious, as if fearing that the silence was merely the interval between two storms. It was one of those moments when power dresses itself in hope. But the eyes of those who know the game know there's always more behind the rhetoric. The scene had all the elements of a political film. Flags waving, tense aides, journalists jockeying for space in front of the cameras, and a man who seemed to savor his own echo. Trump knew the impact those three words would have. The war is over wasn't just a statement. It was a strategy, a calculated move, designed to shift the tide and at the same time reaffirm his role as the protagonist of a global narrative. It's curious how, in times of crisis, peace becomes the most powerful weapon of all. But behind the lights and applause, there was a silent question. Is it really over? Social media was divided between hope and irony, as world leaders exchanged cryptic messages. Many realized that Trump's speech didn't end one story, but rather opened a new one. And, as with any good script, what comes after the end is often the most revealing. Because true power plays rarely end with one sentence. The Gaza agreement. What was really negotiated behind the scenes? What appeared to be a gesture of peace carried the weight of a meticulously played diplomatic chess game. The Gaza agreement was not signed amid flowers and hugs, but under the shadow of invisible interests and pressures. Every comma negotiated represented a life, a territory, a promise. Trump presented the treaty as a victory for diplomacy, but sources close to the process claimed the pact was stitched together with threads of tension and strategic concessions. Israel sought security, Hamas demanded dignity, and between them, the political ambition of those who know how to turn conflict into capital. The media called it a historic agreement, but those familiar with the underbelly of international politics saw something else: a survival pact. As cameras showed handshakes, American, Egyptian, and Qatari advisors exchanged glances that spoke volumes. One military analyst even compared the treaty to a ceasefire with an expiration date. After all, agreements like this are rarely born of trust. They are born of exhaustion, necessity, and often the fear of losing more than has already been lost. Hidden within the document's paragraphs were subtle clauses: controlled humanitarian corridors, economic exchanges disguised as aid, and promises of reconstruction conditioned on political loyalty. It was the old art of selling peace in installments, with high interest rates and flimsy guarantees. And while the world celebrated reconciliation, some knew that the real battlefield had merely shifted, from the ruined streets to the negotiating table, where power is measured in silence and stares. International repercussion. The world in suspense. The news spread across the planet like lightning. In less than an hour, headlines read, "Trump ends conflict in Gaza." In world capitals, leaders watched the speech with indecipherable expressions, some relieved, others worried. In Washington, Congress was divided between applause and suspicion. In Moscow, the Kremlin watched coldly, calculating its next moves. And in Beijing, the reaction was too muted to be anything but strategic. Each power saw in the phrase, "the war is over," not the end of a battle, but the beginning of a new dispute. Who would control the post-war period? Social media became a minefield of opinions. Some called Trump a hero, the peacemaker of the century. Others, a manipulator who turned tragedies into political propaganda. Hashtags of support and rejection engaged in a digital duel that reflected global polarization. The UN called emergency meetings, while diplomats tried to decipher what the agreement truly meant. It was like watching a board game where all the pieces moved at once, and no one knew who had the upper hand. But there was something even more disturbing. The silence of certain key countries. Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Turkey seemed to be measuring their words before taking a stand, as if waiting to see if peace was real or just another American ploy. The feeling was that the entire planet was holding its breath, waiting for the next chapter. Because when Trump talks about peace, the world knows it could be the prelude to something much bigger, or much more dangerous. Trump and the internal political game. Within the United States, the peace announcement fell like a political bombshell. Trump, ever the strategist, knew that every word spoken in front of the cameras would reverberate at the polls. When he declared, "the war is over," he wasn't just speaking to foreign leaders. He was speaking to American voters tired of spending trillions on wars that seemed never-ending. It was a speech tailored to move rural workers, war veterans, and patriotic business people. Peace, for Trump, wasn't just an ideal. It was an electoral asset. Republicans hailed him as the man who did what no one before had dared. Democrats, meanwhile, accused him of theatrics and opportunism, claiming the Gaza deal concealed obscure clauses and corporate interests. On talk shows, analysts debated whether the gesture was genuine or part of a rehearsed choreography to pave the way for a triumphant return to the White House. The truth is that, for Trump, politics has always been about spectacle, and he dominates the stage like few others. But most intriguing was the feeling that the American people, even divided, couldn't ignore him. There was something magnetic about the way he transformed crises into narratives, defeats into slogans, and uncertainty into political fuel. The phrase, "the war is over," began to grace caps, T-shirts, and billboards. And once again, Trump proved he understood something his adversaries still struggled to grasp. In times of chaos, those who control history control power. The price of peace. What nobody is saying. While the world celebrated, on the streets of Gaza, the sound of explosions gave way to an uncomfortable silence. The ceasefire brought relief, yes, but also a new form of pain, that of reconstruction. Peace, announced with pomp, came at a high price, and those paying were not the leaders in the golden domes, but the ordinary families who lost everything. Hospitals destroyed, children orphaned, entire neighborhoods reduced to rubble. The war may have ended in the headlines, but in hearts, it still burned like hot ash under cold rubble. Promises of reconstruction came quickly, wrapped in speeches about hope and renewal. International funds, private companies, and neighboring governments pledged billions in aid. But behind the scenes, each donation hid a bargaining chip: contracts, political influence, access to resources. Humanitarian aid became once again a disguised form of domination. It's curious how peace sometimes transforms into a new form of war, only waged with figures, agreements, and vested interests. And while Trump was cheered at rallies for having ended the war, those living at its epicenter struggled to figure out how to move forward. The cameras were gone, but the pain remained. It was the invisible price of peace, the one that doesn't show up in statistics but screams in the souls of those who survived. Because the end of a war isn't measured by how many shots stop, but by how many hearts are able to restart. And in the case of Gaza, a new beginning still seemed distant. A new beginning still seemed distant. The silence before the next storm. For a time, the world believed it. Headlines spoke of a new era. Political speeches sounded conciliatory, and stock markets rose on promises of stability. But peace, like the desert surrounding Gaza, is treacherous. From a distance, it appears calm. Up close, it reveals cracks that portend storms. Analysts began to notice subtle shifts. Discreet military agreements, cyber espionage, border reinforcements. It was as if the war had simply changed its clothes. Fewer explosions, more manipulation. Trump continued to present himself as the conductor of this new global symphony. He spoke of reconstruction, investment, and sovereignty, but his tone betrayed something deeper: control. Every step, every statement seemed designed to reaffirm the idea that he had not only ended a war, but redraw the chessboard of power. And when someone redraws the map, some territories always lose color. In the Middle East, regional leaders whispered about new alignments, new alliances, and old rivalries disguised as diplomacy. Meanwhile, the people, the very people who celebrated the announcement of peace, began to feel a change in the air. The promises of prosperity were slow to arrive. The speeches repeated themselves, and the atmosphere of hope gave way to apprehension. It was the same silence that precedes thunder. History has taught us that wars rarely end with a full stop. They merely change shape, waiting for the right moment to begin again. And perhaps this time, the battle wasn't for territory, but for narratives. The echo of a war that may never end. Ultimately, what does it really mean to say that the war is over? Is it the silence of the bombs, or the beginning of a new struggle waged behind the scenes, in boardrooms, and in people's minds? Trump may have signed an agreement, but history proves that no pen can erase such deep wounds. The world, enchanted by the promise of peace, may not yet realize that some victories taste like illusions, and that the real battlefields are now invisible. Trump's announcement wasn't just a political statement. It was a masterful power and image play. He understood that, in the 21st century, whoever dominates the narrative dominates the world. And while crowds applaud the end of a war, few notice what lies between the lines: new alliances, new enemies, and the eternal struggle for control. That's why the silence that followed the speech feels so uncomfortable, because it feels like the prelude to something that hasn't yet ended. And you, what do you believe is really behind this peace? Is it the end of a cycle, or just the beginning of an even greater one? Reflect on this. Leave your comment, share your vision, and subscribe to the channel. Because the world is changing before our eyes, and understanding what's happening behind the wars could be the difference between being manipulated or finally waking up.